Today we're going to be talking about the characteristics of fiction and nonfiction, thinking about what the qualities are for each literary form. Those are our two essential questions. So for starters, let's take a look at the qualities of fiction. When we think about the purpose or importance of fiction, the purpose is primarily to entertain. There are instances where fiction can be informative or persuasive. However, the primary purpose of fiction, when we read stories, we read them for entertainment. Think about the times when you pick up a book to read that's considered fiction. More than likely, you're reading that book for pleasure or for sheer entertainment. The audience for fiction depends very much on the genre and the age group. For instance, there's young adult literature, and that type of fiction would be geared to the interests of young adults. If there are people who are into science fiction, again, that audience depends on the genre. But the key is that there's something for everything. So basically, the audience for fiction could be everyone. It just depends on the age group and on the particular genre. Diction, in terms of fiction, is generally very descriptive in nature. You're going to be reading a story, you're going to hear about the setting and the characters, and the author will usually take a lot of emphasis to describe them in great detail to give you a good picture of what the setting's like and what the characters are like. So the diction will be very descriptive. Now with fiction, some of the distinguishing qualities are the elements of fiction. In order to be fiction, you have to have certain elements. Those elements are referred to as plot, characterization, setting, conflict, theme. Without these things, you don't have a story. Every story has to have characters. Those characters have to be doing something in a particular place. So that's plot and setting. And in order for the plot to be interesting, there has to be conflict. Now, the characters in conflict eventually reveal a particular theme. So all of these elements are things that we would see in fiction. Now the author's going to write this story with a particular tone. They might use figurative language to help paint a picture of a scene. They're going to write that story from a particular point of view, and they will use other literary devices like similes and metaphors and personification and foreshadowing and irony. These are all qualities that we might see in fiction. The difference between literary element is that every fiction story will have those elements of fiction. Not every story will have the same literary devices. As we move to nonfiction, in contrast to fiction, the purpose is primarily to inform or persuade. And again, think about the times when you need to read nonfiction. You're usually trying to learn something. You might be doing some research on a particular product and you're trying to become more informed about it. We, as adults, we read nonfiction pretty much every day. It's needed in college and beyond, and it's very practical and very real world. The audience for nonfiction depends on the subject and or discipline and the text type, and again, the age group. So there's a great variety of audiences that authors might write for depending on the particular subject. If, for instance, I'm writing about how to do brain surgery, my audience would be doctors. And the language, therefore, as we think about diction, would be dependent upon the audience. So it's going to be subject specific. I'm going to use particular words that my audience would be aware of and that they're going to know. It could be highly, highly specific. Again, if I'm writing to a textbook on how to perform brain surgery, there's going to be some complicated words in there that only people who are studying to be doctors may understand. The regular, everyday person may not understand that. So the diction is closely related to who the audience is for that nonfiction text. In terms of some other qualities for nonfiction, it's sometimes based on events. The text structures may vary. For instance, it could be comparing and contrasting two products. It could be chronicling a sequence of events where the text structure is going to vary, again, depending on the purpose and the audience. What you will see in nonfiction more often than in fiction is a bunch of graphs and charts and headings, and we can use these graphs, charts, and headings to help us understand the text. Even the size of the font, there's headings and then subheadings, can help us understand the relationship between ideas and to better understand what we're reading. It's important too to be able to read graphs, charts, because the information contained in those graphs and charts may actually be elaborating on the text that you have already read. But again, we're more likely to see those in nonfiction than in fiction. So how is this relevant to us? Well, if you're preparing to take the Keystone exam, you may see some questions that look like this. And at the core of this type of question is they're trying to assess your ability to recognize the characteristics of fiction and nonfiction. And as we think about how these characteristics influence meaning, so take a minute now, read over the question, and see if you could make an educated guess of what the answer is. Now, I know that you haven't read the passage, but I think if you understand what the question is asking and the characteristics of fiction and nonfiction, you should be able to figure it out. Okay, now that you have an answer, the correct answer is you look at the question again, how does the author's use of fiction as a literary form influence the meaning of the passage? Well, the author's use of fiction. So we have to think of what are the characteristics of fiction. And as you look at your answers, it allows the author to present facts about life in the Midwest. Well, and I key in on this word facts here, and I think, well, you're probably more likely to see facts in nonfiction text. So that's probably not the answer. Letter B, it allows the reader to learn about the author's family life. Again, I would key in on the word to learn here, and that's not the primary purpose of fiction. Again, fiction is generally to entertain, so that's probably not the answer. As I look at letter C, it allows the author to use persuasive techniques to create an argument. Again there, persuasive techniques to create an argument is something that we're more likely to see in nonfiction rather than fiction. So that leaves us with D. It allows the reader to understand how the main character feels. Now, we know that one of the elements of fiction is character, and when an author is using fiction, that form of fiction is going to influence the meaning by allowing us to understand how the main character feels. So D is your correct answer. And again, you have to understand that they're trying, if you think about the qualities of fiction and nonfiction, you should be able to arrive at D as your final answer. Take a look at this next sample question. Which characteristic of the passage best indicates to readers that it is fiction rather than informational nonfiction? So again, This question is really just trying to determine if you know the qualities or characteristics of fiction versus nonfiction. So I'm looking for an answer that is something that's specific to fiction but not nonfiction. So if you have your answer, let's just go through the possible answers here. The use of active verbs. Well, active verbs could appear in both fiction and nonfiction. There's nothing distinguishing about active verbs. So that's not an answer. The development of a tone. Again, both fiction and nonfiction texts are going to have tone. So there's nothing that uniquely identifies. Tone does not uniquely identify a work as either fiction or nonfiction. Letter C, the description of the conflict. Conflict is something that is specific to fiction. It's one of the elements of fiction. We have to have it in order to have plot, and plot is an element of fiction. So that's a likely choice. Letter D, the organization of the text. Again, fiction and nonfiction are going to be organized in a particular text structure. So the correct answer is C there, because conflict is unique to fiction, and that's how we know that it's not nonfiction. Let's take a look at one final question. How does the reader know that the passage is narrative prose rather than drama? Now again, we haven't read the passage, so we don't know all of the context. However, narrative prose is just another way of saying story. The word narrative is story, and we know that when we have a story, we're dealing with fiction. So how do we know it's fiction rather than drama? So we're looking for an answer, a quality of fiction that drama would not have. So letter A, the author uses the elements of plot. In both drama and fiction, we're going to have elements of plot, so that's not an answer. The author uses paragraphs. Now, in fiction, in a story, it'll be organized around paragraphs. But in a drama is not organized with paragraphs, so we would recognize that this is a possible answer here. The author uses dialogue. Again, that can appear in both stories and in drama. And the same is true of letter D. The author uses figurative language. So figurative language is something that could appear in both narrative prose or fiction and drama. What's unique to fiction, though, is the use of paragraphs, and that's a quality of fiction that we would not see in drama. So there you have it. That's the way you will be assessed on your understanding of the qualities of both fiction and nonfiction. So, returning to the journal entry that you completed earlier, using the information from your Venn diagram, I want you to create a visual that represents that information. It can be in the form of a web, object, or picture. For example, an apple tree with branches and apples could represent nonfiction literature, and a palm tree with leaves and coconuts could represent fiction literature. Think outside the box to present your information. Be prepared to share with the class. Here's the example that I was referring to. Nonfiction, which is more practical and perhaps used more in the real world, would be symbolized by an apple tree, which is probably more common than fiction. A palm tree, on the other hand, might be a little bit more exotic, might be a little bit more intriguing, entertaining, and interesting, so that could symbolize fiction.